Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a fascinating discussion around embedding DevSecOps in your organization. I'm Georgia Cacace, General Manager of Cybersecurity Consultancy Secure Impact, and I'm moderating today's session. Now, this session will be recorded. You'll be sent a link to the recording after the webinar, so please feel free to forward this to your team, your colleagues, family members, whoever you think this could really help. And on that note, this session is for you. It's meant to be valuable. So please do make sure you get what you need from this. And you can do that by sending through your more specific questions to the panel. Now, these can be submitted throughout the discussion via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll endeavour to answer all of them before we finish up. Now, let's meet the panel. Coming to you first, James. James Line is CTO of SANS, founder of Secure Impact, and numerous other successful companies. Now, James has been in offensive, forensics, malware, and advised on DevSecOps and similar to some of the most well-known companies globally. Now, James is a particularly interesting speaker on this topic because he has a foot in security and then a foot in product and engineering, the place where DevSecOps meets. Now, when I asked James what he was most proud of in his career, he said getting hundreds of thousands of young adults to try cybersecurity to build the next generation. Moving on to our guest speaker today, Frank Kim, who is a SANS Fellow and author of SEC 540, Cloud Security and DevSecOps Automation, and has been teaching and writing courses for over 15 years. Frank's cyber leadership and cloud curriculum has enabled thousands of students to go back to their jobs and better lead their organizations to secure practices that actively keep the criminals out. Now, practices for security leaders have been a hot topic over the last few years, as has securing the cloud post-COVID, which means Frank is right on top of the two most important trends in security and a clearly recognized world leader. So we're delighted to have you here, Frank. Now, when I asked him what he was most proud of, he said helping people take the next step in their careers. And this includes starting the cyber leadership and cloud curriculum at SANS. Moving on to Tom, last but not least, almost said it the other way, Tom Forkes-Gibbs is VP of Technology at Secure Impact and has accumulated over a decade of tech leadership experience, primarily in SaaS, where he ran engineering and platform teams and is a former CIO. Now, he now leads the Secure Impact technical practice, managing technology across the business and overseeing our offensive, defensive, and R&D functions. When I asked Tom what he was most proud of, he said it was the scaling of the tech side of a SaaS startup to serve millions of happy and satisfied users and hearing so many of those success stories.
Probably did a bit of DevSecOps there as well, right, Tom?
Yeah, a little bit now and then.
So Frank, could you start us with the basics? What are the recent trends and developments that make the subject so topical and the all-important benefits?
Yeah, well, in short, DevOps and the move to it is, we need to deploy product and features and functionality faster to our users and our constituents to meet business value, to create business value. And, I'll actually start with an example here. When I first started my career, my very first job out of college was at an organization, a slow-moving bureaucratic company that used a traditional waterfall methodology. So I'll ask everybody here online to just guess in your mind. I'll rhetorically ask a question, is how many times per year do you think we deployed a new version of the application to production? Now, when I ask other people this, sometimes they say, well, you know what, a slow-moving org, maybe once a month, maybe once a quarter. Well, we actually deployed to production 0.7 times a year. That was once every 18 months. It was ridiculous. It was very slow-moving. 18 months would come and go. And that weekend, on that 18th month, we would all be sitting in a large room, all of the engineers, the developers, the managers, the testers, the administrators, struggling to push that application to production. And so, of course, hey, we've learned the hard way over the years that we need to adopt, as Tom, I think, is going to talk about here momentarily, more agile approaches, agile methodologies, and now DevOps, which DevSecOps specifically is making security a first-class citizen in this process to get features, functionality to market faster, not waiting that 18 months to actually deliver some value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe before we get deeper, just a quick recap on some key terms, as you're saying there. So Agile, you mentioned, obviously methodology, it's been around a long time, 20 plus years now. A lot about product in Agile. It's all about listening to customers, making better products, better customer satisfaction, obviously. Some big name adopters early on. I think we're all pretty familiar with the world of Agile, but the word product is used a lot in there. Then we've got DevOps, so a similar period of time, the last 10 to 15 years. I think that's more of a cultural shift, perhaps, versus Agile. So more about breaking down silos, effective collaboration, really important at the moment. A lot of automation coming in, a lot more code. And then, as you say, now into the world of DevSecOps, which is quite a lot newer. I think maybe just the last 2 or 3 years, Frank, something like that. It's been sort of commonly discussed, although some of the concepts obviously aren't as new. So in answer to the question, why now? Well, it's only really been a thing for the last few years. We'd have struggled to talk about it 5 years ago. And that's bringing the world of dev and ops and security and all those best practices together, shifting security left, like we'd previously done with QA and operations in the world of Agile and DevOps. So yeah, really looking forward to getting stuck in. In terms of the benefits of DevOps, I think it's worth talking about those up front. And naturally, as you say, they're tied to, so DevSecOps naturally tied to DevOps. So broad strokes, we're thinking about feedback loops. I think we'll probably talk a lot about feedback loops over the next hour or so. The faster the better, the sooner the better. Obviously pushing quality in the right direction, collaboration, breaking down those silos. There's a skills shortage underpinning all this. So breaking down those silos, opportunities for knowledge sharing, fantastic. Efficiency. We can't have our really valuable security professionals all tied up doing laborious, manual, repeated tasks that could be automated away in the current climate. And ultimately, we hope this improves security. Now, we need to define that, how we measure it, how we talk about it, but those are the kind of the key benefits of DevSecOps, as I see it, and why it's really important to talk about now.
If I might jump on, I'll jump on the back of that, yeah, and then we'll get into some of the how and some of the what to do and what not to do, which is, of course, some of the most valuable stuff for people listening here. Frank pointed out this kind of changing velocity of how we want to be able to ship platforms and solutions and code. Our engineers, as they're building stuff, are trying to run faster and faster and faster with sharp knives. We're providing more rich toolkits and capabilities. Cloud platforms are bringing incredible jigsaw puzzles together of capabilities that can be stitched together in innumerable ways. And you could just do amazing things with software and engineering that were incredibly hard only 10 years ago at incredible velocity. But with all of that comes some danger. We've put the controls to some of those things in the hands of different people. So for me, DevSecOps is about trying to restore some balance and order to our agility, our engineering practices, and security in this world where we're trying to run faster with knives and we have all these new knives and tools to play with. It isn't just a tool chain. It isn't just a process. It's also a culture. It's about training and education, all together with the ultimate goal of enabling product teams, engineers, security people, designers, business leaders, etc., to run faster, but do it more securely than the default path would leave. It's a maturation of the last few years of cloud and engineering that I think is a natural evolution and really quite exciting. So hopefully that's why people are here and listening. And with that, maybe we should talk a little bit more about the how, right?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for setting the scene, all of you. Now, before my next question, a quick reminder to the audience to please send through your questions for the panel. Now, Frank, James mentioned, let's get into why people are here. I'm going to come back to you if I may. You would have seen this hundreds of times both ways. What are the right and wrong ways to go about adoption of DevSecOps? For example, what does successful implementation look like? And what barriers or challenges should our audience look out for?
Yeah, James mentioned a couple key words there. And one of the things that James mentioned was danger. And as an example, I have a friend, a good friend that he's in security. He's a security expert. And this is in the early years, some years ago, in the early days of DevOps, DevSecOps. And we were having a beer together. And about halfway through his second pint, he got a little bit serious, slowly rested the beer back down on the table. In my mind, I thought, uh-oh, what's he going to say? Something is coming. And he said, Frank, I think I finally figured it out. I finally figured out why I hate DevOps and DevSecOps. It's just another excuse for developers to have root access in production, administrative access in production. And I thought in my mind, oh boy, right? Now, the funny thing is that within the next year, he got a different job, worked for a cloud first, as James was talking about, company, and had to do a complete 180 and totally changed his mindset within that year. Well, why? James mentioned another key word is culture. I used to work at a company where our CISO, a new CISO came in, and that CISO came in and looked around and didn't like it. He said, we're going to change the culture of this organization to make it more like a financial institution. And that is the gap. That's the difference, right? When we talk about business, these business outcomes, velocity versus security outcomes, there's a natural disconnect between traditional security approaches, a top-down, need-to-know basis, with DevOps, collaboration, working together, the things that Tom was talking about earlier. As an example, if we think, well, how do we improve? Talking about how do we start to adopt this is one of the key metrics that DevOps thinks about is mean time to recover. How quickly can you recover? How quickly can you reduce that window of exposure? I've seen vulnerabilities that take a developer 15 minutes to fix. Then in a large bureaucratic organization, it takes weeks to deploy that to production. Well, you've got a window of exposure there, security exposure for weeks then. So DevOps, if you measure mean time to recovery, well, what is security traditionally measured? Well, we've traditionally measured things like mean time to failure. Well, in DevOps, DevSecOps, mean time to failure doesn't matter because you expect to fail every single day. What's important is how quickly you can recover and respond to that via some of the automated pipelines, CI/CD integration of security into your pipeline. And to my friend who I was having the beer with, it is not about developers having root access in production. It's about the pipeline. It's about the tools. It's about your infrastructure that's automatically, consistently deployed in a repeatable way. That's kind of the magic. And if you asked me a long time ago when we were deploying 0.7 times a year, I would have said it was magic. But now these are all common practices that we all are adopting.
Yeah, Frank, I know it's not my turn, but I'm going to jump in on the end of that because it just, isn't it amazing how over the past 10 years, what would have seemed like magic has become so powerful and easy, like SaaS platforms with pipeline capabilities where you could snap and plug stuff together and just build how you want stuff to work. That used to be, arcane scripts and bash and, horrible stitching together. It's actually become a lot easier to do this stuff smoothly if you embrace the tools. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and that horrible stitching together, I've seen that firsthand. In fact, I might have resembled some of that in my early days.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of those things that when you've tasted the modern way of doing it, you just can't go back. You can't imagine going back. It just seems just too painful.
Yeah, you start taking for granted, oh, we can do rollbacks. And when I check stuff in, these checks actually run for me and alerts happen and I get told things and not just, I committed it, oh no, I've broken everything. Sorry to interrupt. It was a fascinating epiphany for me how much it's changed.
So Tom, from your perspective, anything to add from having lived and breathed it from the technical side?
Yeah, so I've very much experienced that journey firsthand and the teams that I've worked with over the years. I think just talking from a very practical standpoint, what that journey might look like, or some of the main components, part of that journey. And obviously this is very closely tied to DevOps. That's just the case for all of this. But it all comes back to the pipeline. More often than not, having that really robust gated pipeline is kind of fundamental, foundational. Obviously, automated security testing is going to come into this. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit more detail later. Infrastructure as code, configuration management. I mean, how often have we heard about a breach that it's config management that ultimately was the kind of root cause, if you like. Integrating logging and monitoring. as with all things, it's really hard to deal with when you can't see, to have that visibility of what's going on. And also not forgetting to secure the pipeline and the DevSecOps processes themselves. It's a little bit meta, but that's become a really sort of fertile ground for attackers coming into this. You've automated everything. You've put all your crown jewels, if you like, well, not the crown jewels, the things that manage the crown jewels in this lovely pipeline. That as a place to compromise is yeah, very, very valuable to an attacker. So we have to be thinking as well all the time about applying all this good practice to that framework as well. So those are some very sort of hard skills, sort of practical, visible, tangible artifacts, if you like, of an adoption. But we can't forget the softer side as well. So that the roles and responsibilities that I think necessarily will change. So thinking about asking the question, how deep is your stack? Where are the boundaries of responsibility between individuals, between teams, how teams are structured, and that spins us off into related discussions around things like SRE, so site reliability engineering, or platform engineering. I think it's really important to have those conversations to be really clear on the outset of any kind of adoption program for this kind of thing. And obviously there's the skills shortage as well. We'll probably come back to that again a little bit later on.
Yeah.
So those are some things we can point at and say, look, DevSecOps is happening a bit. Some indicators of doing that successfully then, these are, from a team's point of view, these build on the ones you'd associate with DevOps, and Frank's mentioned a few already. So having that really solid CI/CD pipeline, one that's not flaky, that fails every other push, commit, deploy, that's a good indicator that you're in a good place. The fact that automated security testing exists on some level, obviously we can always do more, we can make it better, but the fact that it's there at all, we'll come back to that a little bit later. Culturally, things like code review and peer feedback, that's obviously been part of the wider dev world for a while, but in security, IT operations hasn't always been the case. Infrastructure automation and security focused metrics. So there we're thinking about things where you said mean time to recovery, Frank, earlier, lead time for changes and the sort of flow of change through the system, going back to DevOps again, deployment frequency, obviously, code quality, toil. I mentioned earlier that idea that we can't have these security professionals in a lot of toil, doing a lot of boring basic stuff day to day. Let's automate that all away. So some evidence that we're going in the right direction there is a good indicator of success. And always, I guess, under all this, there's customer satisfaction at the end of the day. And over the top of all of that is everything is code. That culture that it's code first, code by default, and not an afterthought or something that only one person in the corner of the office knows how to do. It's just becoming part of how we work. So yeah, just a few indicators there and some steps along the way to an adoption from a practical standpoint.
Some really strong indicators, and I suspect to those listening that something you'll be thinking early with everything Tom is listing is, oh my, how do I get all of that done and implemented and declare myself in the panacea of DevSecOps? I've got my leading practices done. One thing I'd say on the back of how to get this underway is, don't try to boil the ocean. Don't make this a technical project about tools and mandate. If you turn up and say, right, the entire organization now works this way, and we do these things with some brittle policy, with no buy-in from the people who are going to use it, it's not going to go well. At worst, it creates friction and resistance. At best, it creates friction and resistance. At worst, it actively disrupts people trying to get work done and build projects, and all that agility that you're trying to build and business momentum is lost. So start with some buy-in, start with some training and some understanding. A lot of security folks rush into this space and fail to take the mindset of the developer. A lot of engineers understand the benefits of things we're advocating here. They like immutability. They like repeatability. They like things defined by code as opposed to defined by people or kind of mechanical Turk-based things. And a lot of what you're going to try and drive in DevSecOps, in automation, in tool use, in pipeline, complies with a lot of their world of best practice if we frame it the right way. So kind of early buy-in, culture work, training developers on secure coding and security so they understand some of the why of this process can be incredibly valuable as well. But make it a process and slowly dial up the maturity, automate early, train early and get buy-in, and then tune it is really key. Or you're going to go too far the other way and it's going to become the blocking project rather than an enabler. And it's really hard to get back from that place. That would be my one master tip on all this stuff. And I'm sure we'll dive into it a little more. Tom, Frank, you agree with that? Or is that an outdated approach? Is it now a throw it in, it's going to work? You know, James is just dated here.
Hey, you mentioned some key points there about pipelines. And, I want to kind of go back to an element of what Tom said earlier. That was another item related to some of the danger we face. Now, hey, the backbone of DevOps and DevSecOps is the pipeline, the CI, continuous integration, CD, continuous deployment pipeline that we're talking about, whether that be implemented in your traditional Jenkins or a GitHub Actions or a GitLab CI/CD or an Azure DevOps, whatever it might be, you all have some sort of pipelines in your organizations today. And the challenge with that, though, is that now you are centralizing things into that pipeline. So now you've got a centralized attack surface there that if an attacker is able to get access to that, well, what can happen? They can potentially, it might not be the developer pushing bad code, making a mistake. It could be the attacker pushing malicious code. So this is why it's important to make sure that you secure those pipelines. But related to that, well, what do you put in the pipeline? Priyam, I see, has a really good question. Priyam mentions SAST and DAST, static application security testing, scanning your code, and DAST, dynamic application security testing. Over the years, having done, countless, hundreds, thousands of code reviews, assessments, reviews, and so on, I will typically talk to teams and say, well, hey, in addition to the code, can you go ahead and share with me your architecture diagrams, your design documents, your test scripts, things like that? And a lot of times in the older days, teams would say, well, we don't have any of that. Here's access to the source code. Just read the code because it is self-documenting.
Oh,
right?
no.
And what else do you actually need? Well, that of course indicates a level of maturity or immaturity of that particular team. But that is also why I think, Priyam, you mentioned right off the bat, SAST, because every team, engineering team, has at least one artifact, which is source code. Because if you don't have source code, well, you don't have a shipping product. So as a result, it's important to, of course, yes, as you mentioned, Priyam, embed SAST and DAST scanning into your pipeline, a lighter weight set of rules to ensure that the pipeline still runs fast. You're not slowing down that all-important developer velocity that we talked about. But to your point, what other things can we do? Now, as Tom mentioned, a key phrase, everything as code. It's not just the application source code. It should be your test scripts. It should be your infrastructure. It should be your network infrastructure. It should be even your documentation. If all of that is code, those things themselves can also be scanned automatically as part of your pipeline itself. So if you think about everything that you do as part of your development process, you're going to apply not only SAST and DAST to your code, but to your infrastructure code, to your Docker files, to your CloudFormation, to your Terraform. But you'll also, taking various GitOps approaches, do stuff at the pre-commit level even before you check in some code to see, oh, is somebody accidentally checking in a secret up to the source code repository, which of course we know that's never happened before. Well,
if I had $1 for every time.
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, those are just maybe some examples of the types of things that you'd want to think about. But Tom, James, yeah, what do you guys think?
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. And that idea of getting feedback early, those feedback loops, there are pre-commits, catch the easy things first, almost down to linting, really, really early on, static analysis later, dynamic analysis. I think we've glossed over a few things here. I'll probably go into a little bit more detail. I'll throw some names out. Everyone gets the shopping list of tools. I would say none of these are endorsed by us specifically, and it will naturally be different for every organization, for every tech stack. Frank, you mentioned things like Jenkins, GitLab, Azure DevOps. There's often a go-to for most organizations for things on that level. But beyond that, we're thinking about SaaS, so on the static side, thinking about code quality, that really early feedback, looking for flaws where conventions are not being followed, best practice isn't being followed. It's kind of easy wins early on with that static analysis. So in that space, you've got the likes of SonarCube, AppScan, Coverity, I think is in that space as well. So that's often an early one in your pipeline that you'd be running, maybe at or shortly after commit or main branch merge. The dynamic side's, I think, a bit tougher and where a lot of teams get tripped up or feels more difficult to get into. So this is when you're testing against the applications in flight, if you like. My favorite in that space is the Z-Attack proxy, OWASP Zap. Obviously it's free as well, which is nice. AppScan again, NetSparker, Burp Suite. There's a few there. You've also got this horrendous dependency chain, which is just, this was one of the things that always kept me awake at night, being in that space, these thousands and thousands of packages and dependencies. Trying to stay on top of that felt like a never-ending and perhaps slightly losing battle.
I see, Tom, you've also written a Node project.
Yeah, there are so many good memes where it was people opening a barn door and a million chickens flying out or whatever. It's just, exactly. God knows. And it's not just from a security point of view. Are you aware of all the licenses associated with all these things and the implications for your IP? I mean, that's scary in its own right. And there's a whole suite. I think all of these spaces are becoming quite crowded. I think a lot of investment found its way into these areas over recent years. But here we're thinking about sort of container scanning and vulnerability analysis and the wider software composition analysis. So we've got the likes of JFrog, X-Ray, SNCC is a common one, Black Duck, Fossa. But again, these are pretty easy ones to plug in as well. I think the DAST one of the three areas is probably the trickiest to get your head around and get running with, whereas a lot of this is just point the right tool at the right thing, and then it's dealing with the output there and false positives and all the good stuff that goes with it. And there's also still a role for pen tests in here as well. We're talking a lot about automation, but we can't forget those other aspects of security that need to fit into the broader picture too. Yeah, just my thoughts on those common components of the automation side.
A list of tools, we're all just letting them wash over us. Yeah. I do think a couple of thoughts on it. The DAST, or the kind of dynamic side of testing, is always more challenging for teams. But the right skilled folks spending time creating the right test pathways, creating the right harnesses, you can get to a point of high value repeatability. Still at some point, human testing, as you say, has value, but you can get pretty far. And I've used all of those tools that you mentioned at kind of some length. You touched on something else I think is really important before we kind of shimmy on quickly. False positives. One of the things I've seen frequently when people kind of integrate all these wonderful tools and they define their pipeline with all these more aggressive steps is an influx of 1 billion and one alerts, whether it's the licenses you mentioned, banned function X or Y, or dependency hell of Z. That's where I think any implementation project here has to come with this heavy dose of training. How do your engineers, how do your security folks figure out the wheat from the chaff? And the tools have got a lot better. They're a lot more accurate than they used to be, but it always comes with this heavy dose of, does that really matter? Should I exclude that? Should I approve it? Should I refactor that? And that is a bit of an active battle, in the same way it was for lots of engineers first getting to code quality reviews, peer reviews, etc. You really have to look at the human side of it, or the automation and the systems, great though they are, produce lots of noisy alerts to be suppressed that don't kind of result in value.
So there's a couple of things there. There's that initial investment and the establishment of those gates and baselines that needs to happen. And that can be where some teams get tripped up because they're saying, oh, it's going to take us a lot of time to get to stage one. But once you achieve a sensible baseline and you start getting some builds and some deploys going through it, you're right, you have to stay on top of it. Things are going to shift, things are going to change, new definitions are going to be introduced. And if you don't stay on top of it, you're basically adding back to that toil ratio from before, and you find yourself in an increasingly bad place. So yeah, it's that initial upfront investment and making the right case for it and explaining the benefits ultimately of doing it, and then staying on top of it and building that into your process as well. Not just clicking the ignore button effectively on every build when it's flowing up a whole bunch of medium warnings and it'll be fine. It's logged, it'll be fine.
Ship it anyway. Ship it anyway.
Risk, yeah, dealt with.
Yeah, but we've got to a place where all the stuff is more instrumentable, more defined in code. You know, I think Frank said earlier, everything is code, but you know, that makes it more repeatable. It makes it more auditable. It makes it more inspectable. If you have the folks with the right skills, you know, as much as I laughed at hey, the source code is the documentation, there's a little bit of that is better than where we were in terms of manually spinning up cloud infrastructures and services and loading stuff. You know, in some cases, everything as code here actually really is quite a positive change for the future. Anyway, I took up too much time. I'll shut up again. Sorry, Frank. You got to mute me whenever I get out of control. You have the power.
So just on one point there, actually, you raised, James, you talked about integrating these tools. So obviously when you're selecting them, that's a really key point. Even if they have all the right bells and whistles, if they don't talk in a nice way, if there's no nice interface, a CLI, whatever it might be, that you can leverage and integrate into your pipeline, it's not worth it. And some of the best tools not that many years ago were all very pointy clicky. That just isn't going to work in a world of automation. So there's some obvious pairings sometimes based on your tech stack and the CI/CD pipeline that you're using. Yeah, definitely one to factor in.
Great. Okay. And so I know a big sort of catalyst for us hosting this webinar was folks' questions around automation and what that looks like in practical terms. Anything else we want to add before we move on for the benefit of the audience?
My only last thought is, and remember, Frank, you have the mute powers.
I wish I knew that at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly. You know, don't be scared to lift your head and look at new tools once in a while. The space is moving quickly. I work with a lot of teams who are on slightly older stacks, you know, older defined pipelines, and there are newer solutions available that solve some of their problems. It's pretty easy for teams not to lift their heads and look at some of that stuff. It is worth looking at a little bit more aggressively than Frank's 0.7 of a year release cycle you mentioned at the beginning. These tools are adopting quickly.
Yeah, speaking of trying new tools, you know, there was Tom mentioned a number of great tools there, and I think one of the things I like to try to do is when I take a step back and look at my suite of tools or my portfolio of tools and see what's integrated into the pipeline or not, is to be able to say, well, we might have been using something for a very long time, and it's hard. Switching costs are difficult. But I try to allocate at least, let's say 10, 20% of the team's time, the engineer's time, to try new things and try out a new tool, see if it'll work in this pipeline or not. What are the results? Static analysis tools, for example, I've seen work to varying degrees, even on different code bases, different applications within the same language. So we're kind of at a point where we do need, you know, multiple different types of tools for different scenarios there. One of the static analysis tools, I don't think, Tom, that you mentioned, that's a little bit of a newer one, is SemGrep, right? Which I would recommend checking out that one for folks here online if you haven't as well. So really, I think, yeah, taking that approach to say, what other tools can you actually utilize to try to get some of that value would be super, super helpful.
Yeah, and having a good process for how you experiment with them. They're sort of safe projects you can use them on, or some way that you're not throwing them straight into production or into your production pipelines, blocking things up and causing a headache. That culture of experimentation is really important as well.
Great. So we've covered quite a bit here. We've defined DevSecOps, looked at the basics, what successful adoption does and does not look like, and the all-important automation. In terms of next steps, what can our audience do today to help them build their own bespoke way forward? And Tom, I'll come to you first if you don't mind.
Yes, I guess it depends. Everyone's on the journey somewhere. There's no sort of one answer fits all to that. I think, as we've said already, the pipelines are really foundational. We all have them, and well, I'm imagining most people watching have a pipeline somewhere, but we can all make our pipelines better, faster, fitter, stronger, more robust. It's very hard to argue against investing in that. I mean, it's diminishing returns after a point, naturally, but having a pipeline that you can really rely on, depend on, that's slick. It's a joy to work with rather than a headache that you might even employ someone. I've certainly seen this. I think many of us will have done. All they have to do is stop a fragile pipeline falling over every 5 minutes. That's their sole job, Jenkins specialist often. That's just depressing. So yeah, I think investing that time in your pipeline, visualizing the pipeline and the flow of change through that pipeline. You can use things like value flow modeling, value flow mapping to look at where the slack is and the opportunities are for optimization in that pipeline. I think that's something pretty much every team can do. And I think we all probably have a sense of how robust our pipelines are and whether that will bring improvement. I think a deep dive on infrastructure as code as well. I think a lot of the concepts we've talked about are generic and be applied to application code or infrastructure code. You might have different teams looking after those different things depending on the way that you're set up. There's probably an opportunity there for shared learnings. So I think encouraging those groups to come together, compare how things are working, aren't working, different tools they might be using, to Frank's point, I think that'd be very beneficial as well. And for those that perhaps aren't as far down that journey, there are definitely quick wins to be had. One that I've seen more often than not, quick win early on, is Dependabot, which is pretty universal. It applies to lots of different tech stacks. You can set it up very quickly and you're immediately feeling your life be better within days of having it installed, in my personal opinion. And there's always the default answer of ChatGPT, because reasons I don't know, but I'm sure it's going to solve our problem somewhere. So why not ask ChatGPT? Seems to be the default answer for most webinars, and they're similar these days. So
just go to ChatGPT and ask, how do I implement DevSecOps?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure that's going to be awesome. Just follow every step, you'll be good. What could go wrong?
And Frank,
those are my ones for today, I think. Sorry, Georgia.
No, not at all. That's great. And yeah, Frank, I mean, the same question to you, really.
I would say that if we look at security teams across the board, there are still many security teams where there is a disconnect between security and engineering and the DevOps team. So if we don't understand DevOps, we can't make a move to DevSecOps, making security a first-class citizen. And really, the reason there's a disconnect is many security teams still don't understand a lot of the topics that we talked about today: infrastructure as code, everything as code, using CI/CD and these pipelines. So a big first step is to look across the team, look at your colleagues, look at your peers, look at yourself and see, hey, well, what do I need to learn about the ways that DevOps is working, kind of all of these various tools and approaches. So that would be number one in terms of making sure that engineering mindset is built into the security team itself. But with that engineering mindset, then I would say number two becomes taking a little bit more of an API-driven approach. And this is something that Tom and James was kind of mentioning a little bit earlier, in terms of, are all of the tools that you're utilizing, do they have an API exposed? Can you automate some of those capabilities? It's no longer about doing a scan and throwing over the results and creating a million tickets for the engineering team. And related to that, I would say kind of number three is providing some value, making it easier for the DevOps teams themselves. This could include, if you've got things that are defined in the pipeline, your security tools that are running, as Priyam mentioned earlier, is to say, make sure that those take no more than a minute or two to actually run. So have those lightweight rule sets defined based upon your understanding of what that pipeline is doing, related to that step number one we talked about. But those output formats, this is something to go back and ask your vendors, do you have a standard output format in JUnit format? Do you have in Serif format? Whatever it might be, you need it in a way that can be automatically transformed through code to then go ahead and make sure that those findings are put into a consumable way into the tools that the development team is using on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And anything from your side, James?
Yeah, look, I think Tom and Frank have given you a lot of wonderful advice here. And what you're probably hearing is there's a fair amount of evaluating the right tools, configuring them correctly, getting the right formats, the right data stores, making sure things aren't brittle, making sure they're truly repeatable, working through and using automation thoughtfully. I think all those things are absolutely on point. I'm just going to double back to the cultural and team side of it. I think, it's crucial if you want this to work well. You break down the silos between security folks, DevOps, engineers, etc. However you define the roles in your organization, and get folks working together. Nothing will kill an initiative like this quicker than working through the pipeline, tools running, a build gets stopped, and finger pointing on some bad code starts. Not, hey, we found an issue, let's evaluate it together, understand it, mitigate the risk, and roll a new build. But you screwed it up, you stopped the build. You can't use that function. You're a horrible person if you ever use that function. And it's surprising how often some of the stuff ends up in finger pointing. And security folks listening, we could be some of the worst for that. We'll get really mad about, how dare you, engineer X, use that function? Are you stupid? But for most of us, sitting down and writing comprehensive, secure, highly performant functional code under pressure and under deadlines would also be a hell of an ask. And so breaking down those silos and getting everyone to be on the same page and use this pipeline, this automation, this process as a way to work towards the common goal of velocity and security, to productivity with security together, is really, really crucial. Consider some of the softer stuff outside of the tools. Nothing wrong with a good old, pizza party bug bounty with security and engineers working together to find problems. Nothing wrong with a bit of blue team and red teaming and changing roles, and using multidisciplinary teams to validate where your process works well and doesn't. Consider those sides of how you roll this stuff out and get people to buy in, so it's self-improving and growing, not just kind of one-time technical project. That will increase success significantly. And make sure you've got a strong champion in the organization, to be the focal point of bringing these practices in and creating buy-in. A good advocate. Make sure you've got folks with the right skills, and don't be scared to get specialist help, rather than folks trying to forge their own path, if you want to avoid standing on some landmines. So think of the people side of it as much as all the wonderful advice on the practicalities of automation and tools that you've heard from my colleagues.
Thanks, James. Anything else from the panel before we move on to Q&A?
I'll just say, James, hey, you did that was a great segue here to remind us to focus on that culture. And you mentioned some of the soft items. At SANS, we've done a DevSecOps survey for years now. And one of the common themes when we ask, well, what has led to your DevOps success, is usually one of the top answers is automation, related to some of the technical topics that we've been talking about. But the vast majority of other responses are things like you mentioned: finding a champion, developing relationships with the DevOps team, making sure that you've got leadership support, breaking down these silos. So it's really DevOps we started the session today as, well, what is DevOps? And sure, the backbone is the pipeline and automation, but it's all of those other things: culture, measurement, information sharing, is building that practice overall. And really it's more of a way of working, right? A way of life, I guess you might say.
I think Frank should come to all our webinars when he summarizes my 9 minutes of rambling verbosity into that short checklist. But yeah, well said, Frank. And sorry, Tom, please.
No, sure. Echoing the same things. It could be very scary for someone who's not done much programming before, but they might be in the security space, the IT space, the operations space, and suddenly is my career over? You can see that's resistance there. They might either not want to adopt it, find reasons not to. So yeah, there's that bringing everyone along in the journey, whether it's through upskilling, sharing, whatever it might be, but that can be a real blocker or a negative outcome that we should all look to avoid.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to the panel, and thank you to the audience for being here today and for sending through your questions. We have quite a list here. Frank, we have one for you first, which is, what are the trends in cloud security faced by companies today?
Yeah, good question. It turns out that every company now that I see is multi-cloud. So I would say one of the trends is multi-cloud. They're multi-cloud, by choice or by chance. By choice, because they've made a specific engineering decision to move to a certain cloud provider, Google perhaps for their machine learning capabilities, Azure perhaps because of their existing stack and integration with that, AWS because of their plethora of services and ability to iterate and move fast on some new types of services. So various different reasons. So by choice, but also by chance, just by nature of geography, just by nature of acquisition, mergers and acquisition, they've acquired somebody that uses a different cloud. So the reason that that's important is that now we as security professionals, we talked about the whole plethora of tools that we might need to be familiar with. It turns out that we also now need to be familiar with the inner workings, the details of how AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud work, depending on what's in your environment, the nuances, the differences of those various misconfigurations. And we've been talking about DevOps all up to this point in time, but really DevOps, the velocity and moving faster is enabled by cloud. So these two kind of trends here in terms of DevOps approaches, automation, and further moving to the cloud to enable digital transformation, well, it requires us as security professionals, yes, to be really in tune with all of those details. So that's one of the biggest trends from a multi-cloud and from an automation perspective.
Any counters on that or agreement?
No, I think that's spot on. And look, I strong statement. If you're going to leverage cloud capabilities today, period, you kind of have to do a lot of the stuff we're talking about to do it responsibly. They are quite part and parcel now, or you lose control of them. So yeah, I very much agree with what Frank said, and make sure you got folks with the right skills that understand the vast surface area of capabilities. And if they don't, send them to Frank's class, because he's a pretty good lecturer.
Well, hey, I'll jump in with that mute button that you were talking about here and offer another example. In the earlier days of cloud, I was involved in a couple of migrations to the cloud. And it turned out, and we knew it at the time, that these were more lift and shift approaches. It is the organization. Somebody made a decision that we need to move to the cloud. Well, why? Well, because it's the thing to do. So they took their existing workloads and then just deployed them in new servers, cloud VMs. And sure, everything worked, but it wasn't any better than necessarily doing it on-prem, because we didn't take advantage of the approaches we're talking about. We didn't take advantage of the API-driven approach that the cloud actually enables. So it was actually more work and more expensive and more time-consuming to just take that lift and shift approach. This is why we've got to, going back to, well, what do we need to do, that kind of initial roadmap for success, make sure that our security teams understand these engineering approaches that we've been talking about this whole session.
Thanks, Frank. Okay, we've got another question. Any advice for teams struggling to get started with DAST? Any takers?
Start.
Yes, I've definitely been in teams that have struggled in the past. I think often you can sort of initially at least bolt it onto other automation that's already there. So you will likely, if you're building software, you'll likely have some functional tests, some end-to-end tests, integration tests already automated, who knows how. And you can often just kind of proxy them through a security tool. So I said Zap, OWASP Zap as a good example. And you start getting new information from that tool. So you don't necessarily have to write a bunch of new tests to start doing that. There might be tests you're already running for other reasons, and you can add the security component, if you like, to it. I'd also say the old don't boil the ocean again, to start with something really, really small. It could be a simple service or even a microservice. It could just be one test, just something to get the ball rolling that you can add to, and obviously not get stuck or blocked on that idea that you have to write tests for everything first up. So yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
Great. Okay. A final question. What do you see as the biggest risks or blockers to adoption?
For me, very briefly, and I'll my panelists respond as well. Frank touched on it with his remark from the survey. He mentioned that sounds runs. Finding your advocate, building culture, building relationships, all those softer factors are crucial. Yes, there's a lot of technical work to do here, building those pipelines, building in the right automation. figuring out how you're going to make Dast work for your particular application target, etc. But if you don't, break down those walls between security and cloud infrastructure folks and engineering, and have people driving stridently forwards together to make this a positive tool for security and velocity, I think I think that's the place where most of these projects hit a sticky spot of blaming, rejection, or kind of too much brittleness or in the way of the day job that kind of gets them unpicked. But Frank, Tom, I mean, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, Georgia, yes. Well, what's the blocker here? And I would say it's fear. And why are people scared? My friend who I was having a beer with, why did he say, he hates DevOps? Well, he didn't understand it, right? And when there's a lack of understanding, that leads to a little bit of that fear and confusion. So when that happens, really it's just a matter of understanding what these workflows are, understanding what these processes are, getting more familiar with them, more comfortable with them. And it takes time. I've seen organizations be on this journey to adopting not only DevOps, but DevSecOps, and it doesn't happen in a month. It doesn't happen in 6 months. Sometimes it's a multi-year journey to actually build that up. Because when you talk about changing culture, right? Well, you can't go in like my CISO did and say, hey, we're going to change the culture and make it more like a financial institution. That doesn't happen because it doesn't work, because the organization's antibodies start to attack you, right? And, you can imagine how long that CISO lasted in that organization. So how do you actually change culture over time? By instilling some behaviors, and it's when those behaviors have been seen to work, the pipeline's successful, the scans in the pipeline actually work, then when the development team and the security team see there's a benefit to working in this way, that's when you start to influence and inform and change the culture. But that cultural change, depending on the org, can take anywhere from, let's say a year on the very fast end, upwards of a decade in big bureaucratic organizations. So it's just a matter of understanding where you are in that overall life cycle.
Thanks, Frank. Some general great life advice there as well in terms of culture. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, hey, I experience that every day with my kids, trying to get them out the door, right? So yes.
Well, look, I mean, a big thank you today, the three of you, and of course for everyone watching. I hope you took some real value from this, and we'll be holding a number of webinars over the next few months. So please do look out for the invitations. Now, we'd love to know what you thought of today's content, and we'll ask that you spend around 30 seconds sharing your honest thoughts on a survey link. It should pop up at the end of the session. We'll be reading each and every bit of feedback. So any time you can spend on that is really appreciated. Now, lastly, if you do have any follow-up questions for the panel, please feel free to contact them directly or come through me and Secure Impact. And yeah, I think we're about 7 minutes ahead of schedule, but yeah, hope you use it wisely. And thanks again for joining, and hope to see you again at the next one.
I'm going to go look up Frank's DevSecOps survey. That's what I'm going to do with my 7 minutes.
Thanks all. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Take care.